Good morning, everyone. We'll just get a PowerPoint up there in a moment. Thanks, Rod. Yeah, okay, what a week. Just click it through till the title slide. Thanks, Rod. Yeah, okay, all right. So, yeah, as we were preparing, thinking about this message for this Smilers service, what happened? Well, just up the road from us, up the New England Highway, a bus full of people coming back from a wedding rolled on a roundabout, 10 killed, many injured. What an incredible waste of life. Next slide. You can see the bus there. Yeah, after a brief ceasefire in Khartoum, I can't say it well, Khartoum, in Sudan, the fighting resumes between the two sides. There are millions displaced. Where do they go? What happens? We just recently met some people who've got relatives there in Khartoum and in Sudan. They can't communicate with them, they can't get money to them, they can't help them. What an awful situation. What a meaningless situation. And we were in Ukraine a few years ago, some of you know that, and the war just drags on and on. Russia wants a vassal state. It thought it could sort of march in and take Ukraine in 2 weeks. Well, they were wrong, weren't they? And so the war drags on, dragging more countries into it, even Australia. Part of all this, people killed every week on both sides, resources diverted that could have been making our world a better place. How meaningless this is. And so as we head into Ecclesiastes 4, I hope you've grasped in the past weeks the teacher's idea of meaninglessness. It's a breath, a mist, a vapour. It's chasing after the wind. That's a favourite expression. It's foolishness. It's useless. And yet so many people in our world are caught up in things that don't make an iota of difference for eternity. Now, maybe you feel that about your life, your past, or your present, or your future. So Ecclesiastes is a book for us today. Now, lest you think that Diane and I chose Ecclesiastes 4 for the Smilers service, it was given to us, no responsibility. But I do think it's a great chapter to do a reality check. So whether you're 88 or 48 or 18. So I'm going to ask you a question. What's the most meaningless thing, according to the teacher here, what's the most meaningless thing that has happened to you this past week or month or year, whatever you choose? And I'm going to ask you to take 30 seconds to talk to the person next to you about this meaningless event in your life. And as you're thinking about that, I think for Diane and me, we attend Bel Air Baptist Church in Newcastle. A young couple we know, they're leaders in the church, having their first baby. And they knew before he was born, Levi was born, that he would have all his blood vessels mixed up. If you don't understand that, talk to the Cranes, they get that. So he had an assisted birth, good birth. He had the best medical care. He had an operation within the week. All looked good, but then infection. 3 months of crying out to God. Life's on hold for the parents. And baby Levi's memorial service was 10 days ago. It all seems so meaningless from a human perspective. But what about God's perspective? That's what we're asking today. We'll get to that. So talk to someone around you. What's the most meaningless event that has happened to you this recent days? Go for it. Any responses? Any, Robert? The bus crash? Meaningless. Yeah. So many people, especially around Singleton and beyond. Anyone else? There was something happening down here, I'm not sure. Anybody else? Yeah. Yeah. Oh dear. Anyone who's bringing up children knows that you dress them and then they get dirty or something, spill something, and then you dress them again, you change them, and bringing up children has a lot of apparently meaningless time in it, does it? All right, Rod, next slide. So we began working on this, this message in Sydney Airport, as you do, walking through the new luxury precinct. Have you seen it? We're on our way to Singapore a few weeks ago to our church over there. Now, if there's one place that symbolises chasing after the wind, I think this is it. The new luxury, shameless, all the big brands. Next slide. So we get to Singapore airport and guess what? Same stuff. They're all selling exactly the same stuff. It's very expensive stuff, and it's very entertaining to watch people parading their stuff. I think Ecclesiastes, the teacher, has a lot to talk about this. Go, Di.
So let's recall the story thus far. You'll jump into Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 1. Everything is meaningless. Verse 12. Wisdom is meaningless. And that's rather curious because we know that wisdom actually really is important. As we saw in Proverbs, wisdom is important. It's mentioned in the Old Testament 167 times, New Testament 50 times. There's even a genre of wisdom literature, meaningless. In chapter 2, verse 1, pleasures are meaningless. Verse 12, wisdom and folly are meaningless. Verse 17, toil and work is meaningless. And we see in the next slide, chapter 3, we jump in and we see, yet there is a time for everything. Verse 11, God has made everything beautiful in his time. He's also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from the beginning to the end. And I think that's a clue to understand this book. Verse 14, I know that everything God does will endure forever, but nothing can be added to it and nothing can be taken away from it. God does it so people will fear him. Perhaps that's another clue.
So, just to summarise, this is the fourth message from Ecclesiastes, that everything in the created order is a vapour. It's a breath, a mist, including life itself. Only God is beyond that. Now that's either depressing or it's comforting for us. Take your pick. Let's call it a reality check. Now, as James says before, this is not a call to head off to a monastery. You can't run away from the question about what life is really about. You can only try and fill up your life full of stuff. Okay? The question is, what is true happiness, joy, blessedness? Now, as a little aside, because I used to teach this stuff at morning, classical Buddhism, and I don't mean popular Buddhism or Western or modern Buddhism, I mean the real thing, has thought through these questions and come up with some really quite respectable answers. I think it's the only serious contender to Judeo-Christian thinking on this subject about, what the meaning of life really is. However, I do confess that classical Buddhism's answers to this aren't a good reason for getting out of bed in the morning, and so I much prefer the Bible's approach. Next one, Rod. So, the teacher is building the case. We're being questioned. How do we answer? And so the teacher is giving us a series of snapshots. Next one. Yep. Descriptions of the way life is from a human perspective, a normal human existence. Now, in my humble opinion, the past 50 years in Australia of the comfortable, for many of us, middle-class, white Australian life has been a blip on human history. And some of you have grown up here today, some of you have grown up in the shadow of the Great Depression, of the World Wars and lots of other wars. You knew when mortgage rates were 16%, right, or more? When people lost everything in stock market crashes. Life is fragile and easily appears to be meaningless. So in Ecclesiastes 4, the teacher gives us 4 images or snapshots of the human race to do our own reality check. And the first one is the meaninglessness of oppression. Then there's a meaninglessness of working for no ultimate purpose, no great reason. There's a meaninglessness of life alone. There's a meaninglessness of fame and power. Now, I think these issues are just as relevant today for us as in any period of history.
So let's jump now into snapshot number 1, the meaninglessness of oppression in human history. Now, I have my Aussie passport. I'm in the process of renewing this, but the Aussie passport is the 8th best in the world, shared along with Canada, Greece, Malta. Just one behind New Zealand. We have no idea what it is like to have a passport or not have a passport where you could put fancy visas and stickers and get into any country that you would like. Take a look if you'd like to see some of these later. If you hold a passport from Syria, from Iraq, from Pakistan, from Somalia, from Afghanistan, well, where will you go? It's easy to take a progress view of history, somehow that next year will be better, and the year after that will be better again. But we think of Peru, the country that we lived in and brought our kids up in for 13 plus years, a country that again is descending into chaos. That's, well, the same sort of chaos we saw in the 1980s. It's not really progress. There's a cycle that's happening. But those at the bottom are asking, why are we just here to serve the rich? Our Syrian refugee friends here come fleeing from oppression. They're desperately trying to get their families out and their members before they're killed or they die because of hunger, disease, or political strife. In Newcastle, there are more and more people sleeping in their cars at night. What about Sydney, where renting is even harder? According to the teacher in Ecclesiastes, it's better to be not born than to come into such a world. Well, does that sound outrageous? What about the story of a young man from Nigeria who's willing to risk death to get to Europe to bring hope for his family rather than to stay in a place where there is no hope? I don't know how many of you have seen the movie on Netflix, The Swimmers. Just an amazing and very true story of what it means to escape tragedy in that sense. But then there's the story of Jesus himself. He was born into a situation of oppression. His family had to escape from Herod's bloody rampage down to Egypt. They had to hide in Nazareth. And then through his ministry and death, with the Jewish leaders, the interaction with Herod and Pilate and the Romans. No wonder we read in Hebrews chapter 4 that Jesus was a man who could identify with suffering and his identification with a suffering humanity. All of this violence, all of this oppression by megalomaniacs, the teacher says, is simply meaninglessness.
Next one. Then there's the meaninglessness of working for no real purpose. And on one hand is the foolish person who won't work. That's described here in Ecclesiastes. On the other hand is the person who's working purely to make more money. And the teacher is saying both are meaningless. The teacher says, I saw that all toil and all achievement spring from one person's envy of another. Think of all those who got up early this morning to train, perhaps for the Olympics, to get gold, to be the fastest, the strongest, the most agile. What do you do after you get gold? And then for everyone who does get gold, there are 1,000, 10,000 people who wish it were them. But then, building on this, what about the meaningless of those who have jobs that underutilise their abilities and skills? There are people who are working long hours, and they're saying, I'm just waiting for my pay packet. I'm just waiting to get to a time when I can enjoy life, whether it's the evening, the weekend, the annual holidays, whatever it is. Maybe it's retirement. I'll enjoy life when I stop working and I retire. But does that retirement have any purpose? Does our lives full of entertainment have any purpose? And getting back to Ecclesiastes talking about the sake of just making more money, the teacher says, better one handful with tranquility than 2 handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind. There's something here about the dignity of work done well with purpose. Next one. So, there's the foolish person who is all alone, no family, probably no friends, and there is no end to their toil, it says. Yet their eyes are not content with their wealth. And so they should be asking themselves, perhaps they are, for whom am I toiling and why am I depriving myself of enjoyment? It's better to enjoy life than waste it on simply making money for what? Meaningless. But when we come to look at Jesus, we find a fellow traveller who understood what it was to work for ultimate purpose. Jesus talks a lot about money and work, about investing in heavenly treasure. Jesus didn't waste a day or a moment. Next one.
Then we move into the meaninglessness of life alone. Again, I saw there was something meaninglessness under the sun. There was a man all alone. He had neither son nor brother. There was no end to his toil, yet his eyes were not content with his wealth. For whom am I toiling, he asked, and why am I depriving myself of enjoyment? This too is meaninglessness, a miserable business. 2 are better than 1 because they have a good return for their labour. If either of them falls down, one can help the other. But pity one who falls and has no one to help them up. If 2 lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, 2 can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. That person in verses 7 and 8, the person who is working to accumulate wealth with no one to leave it to, well, that actually has a bit of a twist today because of the increasing longevity and the cost of healthcare. Behind this holy grail of individual autonomy in our society is this: I need enough money to look after myself in my old age in a way that I want to. In Singapore, we have the privilege of just seeing what it meant for our brothers and sisters who are Indonesians, Filipinos, South Asians, working there hard for their families. Sure, it's really tough, but they're not alone. The meaning behind their work was to be part of family and to contribute, meaning in labour. Then we read that two are better than one. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. And of course, that's often used to talk about weddings and, sermons around marriage. But marriage is only just one example of the power of shared lives. And this is where Christian community can really shine or fail. How well do we do community even here? It's the biggest challenge that we face in our society that's increasingly doing life alone. Life alone in marriages, life alone in families, in sports. I might talk proudly about my freedom, my privacy, my choice, my rights. Individual autonomy is really foundational to our Australian society. The teacher of Ecclesiastes sees it differently. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. Though they may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. Yes, you can read marriage into that, but let's not limit it to that, but to apply it to our lives in general. That's life. Let's do life together, not life alone. That's God's ideal for us. Life takes on a whole deeper meaning when it's shared. God wants us in community so that he can make us more like Jesus. After all, that's exactly what Jesus was doing with his 12 disciples, living life together, bringing natural enemies together and welding them into community, simply learning what it is to get on with one another. When God said in Genesis, it's not good for man to be alone, he was referring there too to much more than marriage. He was calling Adam and Eve to become the ancestors of the human race, a community of beings that would connect to him as Trinity and to one another as humanity. How are we doing? How are we doing as a church? Do you wish in your soul that somehow we could do better there? Well, how could the you as individual deepen you as community? I leave it with you.
So we come to the last few verses of Ecclesiastes chapter 4. It's a little tricky to interpret here. So it's a story about an old but foolish king, a king who can't really govern anymore. And the youth comes in and he takes over and he's doing a good job, but then the people go, nah, we're tired of him, we'll get someone else as well. However, it's meant to read exactly. The meaning is clear, that we live in a world where we seek recognition and power in daily life, but it's elusive. As he said, the old man's king, but he ceases to be a good leader, then he's gone, he's replaced by a younger man who's rejected, and so on. Power is meaningless. You get beaten up by the boss at work, and then you go home and you kick the cat or you yell at the kids or that sort of thing. This is power, and it's deceptive. Mentioned earlier, the meaninglessness of fame in the sporting and celebrity world. There's nothing wrong with being the fastest, smartest, whatever. But if that's the end point, if that's what it's all about, then it's meaningless. And this sort of attitude, this celebrity culture is all around us in society and the church. It's carefully nurtured by the media and by brand makers, isn't it? Who knows, to be honest, who knows when the next big-name preacher or church adored by millions will be caught up in scandal. Meaningless. Next one. So, going back to our comments on the meaninglessness of life alone, and this is for you who are leaders here, we can add that having fame and power, and especially seeking fame and power, make us stand out from others and make us more alone, make us more vulnerable to being corrupted. I think we, as Christians, we need to have a good understanding of the inherent corruption of the human heart, our hearts. because our hearts will try to deceive us when we find power and fame. And Jesus, more than anyone else, understood that well. And he understood the traps of loneliness, life alone, and the lure of fame and power. And you'll remember that the devil tempted him in the wilderness to take the easy road, to become famous, to demonstrate his power. And then there's another story in John where he tells us that after feeding the 5,000 plus, that the people wanted to do what? Make Jesus king. And it says, John says, Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. He understood what was involved here. So yes, Jesus did come to bring meaning into our broken world. But we have to say that God doesn't remove us from that brokenness, just as he didn't distance himself from the pain and the suffering, the meaninglessness of our world. In the thinking of the teacher, the only thing more meaningless than God emptying himself to come into our world as a helpless human baby is for that God-man to allow himself to be nailed to a cross. Taking on the sin of those driving the nails into his body, and the sin of those running away, and the sin of those denying him. This is totally meaningless unless there's another story, another kingdom founded on totally different values and principles, centred around a totally different kind of leader. Jesus' upside-down kingdom is the answer to the question of the meaning of life. But it's not an obvious answer, and it's not a logical answer to our neighbour or our colleague at work or at school, whatever. For those around us, to be honest, Christianity is an upside-down kingdom. An upside-down world that challenges the basics of this world in which we live, where real power is found in weakness, hence the power of the cross, where the meaninglessness of prestige is overcome by humility, hence servant leadership, where we discover our true selves in the community of others. That is a massive challenge to individual autonomy in our society. My rights, my everything. Where the dangers of wealth and prosperity are overcome by generosity and stewardship. Where taking up a cross, an instrument of death, is the path to life. That sort of world, that sort of kingdom makes little sense to those around us who are trying to get to the top. It does look like an upside-down kingdom. But then, which way is the right way up?
Well, today we want to recognise those in our midst who, with God and each other's help, have made sense of this upside-down world and have followed Jesus for many years. You are the signposts to Jesus' upside-down kingdom, which is actually the right way up. We also want to give hope to those here who are trying to make sense of this meaningless world around them, which promises so much and delivers so little. That's because it is actually upside down, and we can only find meaning in Jesus as we practice community together. In the coming chapters, the teacher will continue to teach us about life in this broken world and how people look for answers in all the wrong places. Really, it's about following Jesus in the everyday and making sense of meaning in the everyday. That's what is being called a Jesus follower. And that's what we call ourselves. And that's a good way to begin a conversation with others when they're struggling too with these same questions about what is the meaning of life. Let's pray.
Father, thank you that you have revealed to us what life is about. That in this apparently meaningless world, we find deeper realities than we can see with our senses. And you ask us to live by faith, that you have given the meaning by which we can live by right now, today. How we can interact with one another. That we can give up some of our individual autonomy and embrace community. We can let go of our pride and embrace humility. We can give up our desire to be rich and famous, despite what all the advertising is telling us, and embrace simplicity and freedom. Lord, some of us are struggling with that right now. Some of us have walked this path of freedom for many years and have much to share with us about how to survive in our world, how to share your love with others who are struggling. Lord, thank you that you have revealed to us. It's not something we cleverly work out for ourselves, but you have revealed that. And so we embrace that and we encourage one another. We embrace each other and community to be your people here in this place, this day. Lord, as this church continues these studies in Ecclesiastes, listening to the teacher, Lord, might each one here be able to embrace the incredible wisdom that is here, that the world doesn't know, but that we can share with others and live ourselves day by day. Amen. Bless you all in your journey.